Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for module number 5. So we're moving beyond scales now, and we're going to talk about intervals. So this is an introduction to intervals. So this isn't everything about intervals, but it's going to teach us how to recognize them, so how to identify them on the staff. Okay, so our objectives for this video are to first define the term interval, to be able to understand an interval's numerical name. Okay, and you know what these are. These are like seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, octaves, things like that. Another name for that is the tonal interval class, and I prefer tonal interval class, but the book just calls it the number, so we'll use both. And then the intervals modifier. I think this is normally called quality, but again, the book has the name modifier for this. But those are things like major, minor, and perfect, and things like that. So we'll talk about how to identify those. And then finally, we'll be able to label perfect, major, and minor intervals on the staff. Okay, let's define interval. An interval is just a measurement of the distance between two notes. Now notice that I'm saying notes, right? And this is kind of a tricky distinction. So people will often use the term note and the term pitch interchangeably, but we need to be able to distinguish between those two terms. So a note is just something that's written on the staff. So a note is like the way a pitch is written, but a pitch is just the sound. Okay? So when we're talking about intervals, we're talking about the way it looks on the staff, not necessarily what it sounds like. Okay, you know what these are. Like I said, these are things like a perfect fifth is an interval, a major third is an interval, a perfect unison is an interval, a perfect octave is an example of an interval. Okay, there are two kinds of intervals in general, but there's not really any difference between them. But we have things that are called harmonic intervals, and those are simply intervals that happen at the same time. So that's like a chord. So I could play this on the piano, right? And those happen at the same time. Those are two pitches that happen at the same time, two notes that happen at the same time. So when they happen at the same time, we call them harmonic intervals because they create a harmony. The other kind of interval you can have is a melodic interval, and that's just one note after another. And we can measure the distance between those two notes, okay? So it is important to know the difference between a harmonic interval, which are two notes that happen at the same time, and a melodic interval, which are two notes that happen one after another, but they're measured in the same way. So those two different versions I played are actually the same interval. One just happens at the same time, and one happens one after another. Okay? All right, so there are two parts to this measurement, and the first one we're going to talk about is actually the second part of the name, which is the number or tonal interval class. And this is simply the distance that the two notes cover on the staff. Okay, and then the other part is the first part of the name, which is the modifier or quality, and it's a little bit trickier to understand. And it depends on the accidentals or lack of accidentals that the notes have. And it's really related to the number of half steps between the two notes, which we'll talk about in a second. So let's talk about that second part, which is the easier of the two to understand, which is the number or the tonal interval class. Okay, so the number or tonal interval class is simply how far apart two notes appear to be on the staff. Okay, so some examples. If two notes are on the same line, so there we have a C and another C, there's no difference between them, so we call that a unison. Okay? And so it's like a scale degree number, kind of, like those are both the first part of a scale, right? So we'd call that 1. Instead of saying 1, we call that a unison. Okay? So that would just sound like this. So it's the same note, so there's no difference. We call that a unison. Okay? Two notes that seem to cover kind of two lines and spaces on the staff. So here we have note G on a line and then note A on a space. That covers one line and one space. So that's two different, things on the staff, right? So we call that a second because it spreads across two different lines and spaces on the staff. Okay, so 1, 2. We call that a second. All right, and then you can keep going with this. So another step apart would be a third. And then after that, you'd have a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, etc. Okay, and you can keep going. And once you get up to 8 lines and spaces on the staff, like that one is, we call that an octave. Okay? So basically what you're doing is you're counting the distance that the two notes are spread apart, right? And if it's the same note, we call it a unison, not a one. If it's a second, if it's spread across 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 4, 5, 6, 7, we call it by its ordinal number, like second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. And then once we get to 8 lines and spaces between the two notes, we call it an octave. Okay, so that's the basics. Now, there's some things to remember that get kind of confusing with tonal interval class or number. And that is, the number is very much like the scale degree. The lowest note is counted as 1. Okay, so here we have an A to a B. So we call that, we look at that like it's part of a scale. So A would be the first degree of the scale. B is the second degree of the scale. So we say that the distance is a second. Okay, so in other words, you're counting with the number 1. Okay, accidentals will never change the number of the interval. So here we have something that is a sixth because it is spread across 6 lines and spaces on the staff. And here, this is still a sixth, so even though we've added a G sharp to that bottom note, it doesn't change the number of the interval. It's still a sixth on the staff. So accidentals will never change the number of an interval. Okay, intervals that are larger than an octave are called compound intervals. Okay, and you can see here if you counted those, that F to that A would spread over a tenth because it's 10 lines and spaces from each other. Okay, but in most of the time in music theory, we don't really care that it's a tenth. We just simply reduce it to what's called a simple interval, which is just an interval that's lower than an octave. So most of the time, we really only care about the intervals unison through octave. And then anything beyond an octave, we'll just reduce so that it is an octave. Okay, so like a ninth, since that's one more than an octave, we would just reduce that to be a second. Okay? You can also, another trick to think about that is like you subtract 7 from it. So that tenth there minus 7 equals 3. So a tenth is also a third. But for most purposes, compound intervals are reduced to simple intervals. And we just analyze them that way. Okay. Let's talk about the trickier part, which is the modifier or quality of an interval. And this is just the measurement of the number of half steps that exist between the two notes. Okay, so here are some examples of their interval numbers with their quality. So we have over there all the way on the left, G to B. So that's a third, but more specifically, it's a major third. And then if we made that smaller by adding a flat, we'd have the next interval there, G to B flat, and that's a minor third. And then the next interval there is F to B flat, which is a perfect fourth. And then at the end there we have a B natural to an F sharp, which is a perfect fifth. Okay, so as you can see, the accidentals matter when determining the modifier or quality of the interval. And they're also related to the number as well. So you're not able to have a perfect third, for example, and you'll never have a major fourth, for example. Okay, so the number, the interval number can only be particular qualities. Okay, the quickest way to know the quality of an interval is to compare it to the notes of a scale. Okay, so let's look at how that works. So let's talk about unisons, fourths, fifths, and octave. So these are the same whether the scale is major or minor. So we refer to these intervals as the perfect intervals. Okay, so a unison, a fourth, a fifth, and an octave are the same no matter if you're in a major scale or a minor scale. So we call them perfect. Okay, and so here we have two notes separated by 5 lines and spaces. So this is going to be some kind of fifth. So we know that this has the potential to be a perfect fifth. Over here we have another 2 notes that are separated on the staff by 4 lines and spaces. So this is a fourth, which means it has the potential to also be a perfect fourth. Okay, they'll never be a major fifth or a major fourth because that's not possible. Okay, and to determine if it is perfect, we'll imagine that the lowest note of the interval is the first note of a scale. Okay, so over there on the left where we have our fifth, the lowest note of that interval is a D. So we'll compare those two notes to what they should be in a D major or D minor scale. Okay, and so we're going to see if it matches the fifth degree of the scale because we're trying to find out if the fifth is perfect. So go up the scale until we get to the fifth note, which is A. So that does match. So since that matches what should be in the major scale, with based on the lowest note, which could be D major or D minor, it matches. So that is a perfect fifth. Okay, so if you count up the scale and it does match what should be the fifth note of the scale, it is a perfect interval. Let's look at the second one here. Oh, and of course, we have a shorthand for this, like we have shorthand for everything else. We just write P in front of the interval instead of the word perfect. So we'll just say P5. That just means perfect fifth. I did write fifth there accidentally, but I should just say P5 when you're ready to write that. Okay, now let's look at the second interval. We have an F to a B natural. So we want to compare that B natural, which is the fourth, to what should be the fourth note of an F scale. Okay, could be F major, could be F minor, doesn't matter. So let's see. So we see that the fourth note of an F scale should be a B flat. So that doesn't match. Okay, that B natural is not what it should be. So then we say that that's something other than perfect. Okay, and we'll learn what that is in the next couple videos. But for now, it's enough just to know that that is not a perfect fourth. It's some other kind of fourth. Okay, so I think in the homework you just write an X for things that are not perfect. Okay, so to summarize, when you're dealing with unisons, fifths, fourths, or octaves, you want to compare the top note of the interval to what it should be in the scale based on the bottom note of the interval. Okay, and if it matches, then it is a perfect interval. If it doesn't match, then it is not a perfect interval. Okay, so the other intervals of the scale can change depending on whether the scale is major or minor. Okay, so these are not perfect. So we give them those intervals, which are seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. We give them different names, and those names are either major or minor. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples. Here is a C natural down to an A flat. We'll also look at F up to D flat. So we know just by counting the lines and spaces that those two notes cover that this is a third. So it could either be major or minor. So let's compare it to the scale, that is the lowest note. So the lowest note is an A flat, so we want to look at the A flat major scale. Okay, so you always compare the top note to the major scale that's based on the bottom note of the interval. Okay, and if it matches, which this does, that C natural is the third of a major scale, then we know that this is a major third. Okay, let's look at this next one, which is a sixth. So F to D, D flat, doesn't matter what the externals are. That covers 6 lines and spaces, so this is some kind of sixth. So it could be major or minor. And so you want to compare it to an F major scale to see if it is the right note for major. And you can see that the sixth note of an F major scale should be a D natural. So that doesn't match our major scale. And in fact, it is a half step lower than it should be, because D flat is a half step lower than D. So whenever a major scale is smaller, or I'm sorry, a major interval is smaller than it should be by a half step, it becomes a minor scale. Okay? So since that top note should be a D in order to be major, we know that if it's a D flat, which is smaller by a half step, that it's a minor sixth. So that's a minor sixth there. And of course, we have shorthand for this too. We just say M to indicate major, sorry, capital M to indicate major, and lowercase m to indicate minor. Okay, and you just write M3 or M6. Okay, so to summarize that, seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths can be major or minor. They'll never be perfect. join the club. But they'll be major or minor. And so that's determined on whether or not they match what is in the major scale of the lowest note. Okay? So our C to A flat, we compared that top C natural to an A flat major scale. We determined that that C matches what the third should be. So that is in fact a major third. Then we compared our F to D flat in the second measure there, and we determined that that doesn't match the sixth note of an F major scale. It's a half step lower than it should be, so that's a minor sixth. Okay, there's one more way to determine quality, and this way is a little bit more cumbersome, but if you can think about it this way, it does help because it gives you a little bit more flexibility. And that's to determine the quality of an interval by counting the number of half steps between the notes. The downside of this is there's a lot to memorize, such as this giant chart over here. Okay, you can see that I've highlighted in bold the perfect intervals, and the ones that are not in bold are the major or minor intervals that can change depending on the number of half steps. Okay, so the first step is to determine what kind of interval you have, and then to know how many half steps that should be, and then check to see how many half steps you actually have between the two notes. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples. So here's a partial keyboard here with C4 identified and a staff. Let's look at the one that we already know, which was C down to A flat. We know that's a major third, and let's figure out how we could have discovered that as a major third. So you look on the chart, you see that's a third, and a third can be either major or minor. If it's major, it'll have 4 half steps between the two notes, and if it's minor, it'll only have 3 half steps between the two notes. So then you figure out where they are on the piano, and it's represented here by the 2 dots, and then you simply count the number of half steps between the two notes. Notice that I'm counting from 0, right? Because it's different than when you're counting the tonal interval class. You're not counting it like a scale. You're counting the distance between the two notes, okay? And not necessarily, not the space that the two notes occupy on the staff, okay? So you always count starting with 0 when you're doing this. You can see that there are 4 half steps between these two notes. So that means that this is a major third, like we figured out earlier. Okay, let's look at another one. So this is a G natural up to an F sharp. So that is a 7th. We know that just by looking at it on the staff. And a 7th could be either major or minor. If it has 11 half steps, it'll be major. If it has 10 half steps, it'll be minor. So find the two notes on the piano, and then count the number of half steps. Takes a while to get there. So just kind of skipping ahead, that'll be 11 half steps between those two notes. So we know that that is a major 7th. Okay, so let's do one more. This is a G flat to a C flat. So we know that that's a 4th just by looking at it on the staff. And in order for a 4th to be perfect, it should have 5 half steps between the two notes. If it doesn't, it's not perfect. Okay, so there's our G flat on the piano. There's our C flat on the piano. Count the number of half steps. Okay, so we get up to 5 half steps, which is correct. So this is in fact a perfect 4th. Okay, so it does take a little bit longer, but if you're really used to the piano and if you know the number of half steps for every interval, it can be a little bit faster to figure this out rather than the scales. Okay, so to summarize, for most people, I think the quickest way to determine what we call an interval is to first determine its number, tonal interval class, by counting the lines and spaces between the notes on the staff. So the amount of space they occupy on the staff, the number of lines and spaces they're spread across. Then sometimes at that point you're done. So you can often just call things thirds, fifths, sixths, and things like that, especially when we're just dealing with one key. Okay, but then if you also have to figure out the quality, you have to compare the scale degrees, the notes in the the interval to the scale degrees of a scale. So if it's a fourth, fifth, or octave, it could be perfect. And if it matches the first, fourth, fifth, or the octave in the scale, then it is perfect. If it doesn't, it's not perfect. Okay, if it's a second, third, sixth, or seventh, and it matches the second, third, sixth, or seventh degree of a major scale, then the interval is in fact major. But if it is a smaller by a half step than what the major note should be, then it's a minor scale, or sorry, minor interval. Okay. So yeah, that's intervals in a nutshell. I think the homework just asks you first to identify the tonal interval class in the first section. Then I think in the second section, it's a bunch of possibly perfect intervals, and you just have to identify which ones are perfect and which ones are not. And then I think the third section is intervals that could be major or minor, and you just have to determine if they are, I think you have to determine the number, and you also have to determine if they're major or minor. Okay, so it kind of separates it out, so you don't have to figure it out all the way yet. Okay, and it's just identifying, you don't have to write them yet. We'll talk about writing them in our next video. Okay, well, if you have any questions, save it for the Zoom session, or you can email me, or post it to the discussion forum. And other than that, thanks for watching, and have a great day.